Hi, in this lesson we are going to discuss functions. A function you can think of as a reusable named block of code. So previously we looked at compound statements that were not named, and we talked about scope and so on. Now you've also seen that when it comes to if-else statements and loops, we also have compound statements or code blocks, but you don't really call those, right? Like when you call your friend or your pet, you don't really call those loops or those if-else statements. They kind of just happen as the program executes. When it reaches that loop or the if-else statement, then those will execute depending on Boolean conditions or whatever else. A function is different because we can call or invoke it. So again, it's like a block of code or a compound statement, right? That contains one or more statements within that code block, which will then execute when you call that function. It's almost like when you call your dog and you ask it to sit or to roll around, something like that. You call it and it will do something. So it can add two numbers together, it can display something to the screen. So it all depends on the functionality that you need. So functions also save us time. They save us from having to retype the same code over and over again. Let's say something simple like a dice roll for your game. Let's say you do 50 dice rolls. If you have one function that says roll dice, you don't have to write the functionality for that each time you want to do a dice roll. A better example would be a function. Again, when you call a function, it will execute whatever is in its body, right? Now let's say in its body you have a for loop or a switch statement, so multiple lines, right? Multiple statements. And without using a function, let's say you do the same stuff 50 times throughout your program. You can have hundreds of lines in that file because you're doing the same stuff over and over again. That's the thing with functions. You can have fewer lines of code, and it saves us from having to retype the same stuff over and over again. And the calling function will then be much more concise. So fewer lines of code, it'll probably be easier to follow as well. Now the calling function is the function that calls your custom function. So if I call my pet, then I'm the calling function. So we need some calling function. For the programs that we'll be writing for now, the main function will be the calling function. And you can actually call the same function within the same function as well. But we'll talk about that stuff in Module 102. So in this video, we'll talk about the void function. Just to get started, we'll look at a basic example. So when we started off the course in the first lesson, we did a Hello World demo. And so how can we write a function that will output hello to the console? So we'll just do something simple like that. And then in the upcoming videos, we'll add more to this. It's important to declare your function outside of another function. So in this case, we have this main function right here. You need to give a function a return type. So in this case, we'll give it the void type. Now a type, of course, is something like int. You can see here with main. Main also has a return type, int. Now, as we'll see in upcoming videos, your functions can return a value, just like here in the main function, where we return 0 to the parent process. Now, similarly, we might want to return a value. So let's say we add two values together, two integers, then we want to return the result of that computation. But in this case, we don't want to return something specific. So it's going to be a void function. I'll call my function hello. And as you can see, we also have the parentheses, just like you have with the main function. And then I simply print out some string. You can print out whatever you want in here. Hello world. I'm saying hello world function call so that we know specifically where that comes from. How do we now call or invoke this function? Well, you need a calling function. So in this case, we'll do it from the main function. And you simply use the name of the function followed by those parentheses. I'd also like to note again that the naming rules for function names are the same as when you do names for variables. Okay, so let's just call this function in the main function. So in this statement, I'm calling this function. So again, you end that off with a semicolon. I'll just build and run this, and you can see that the string now prints out to the console. So let's say we cut that out, paste it down here. What will happen now? You can see in the error list, hello, identifier not found, right here. So this again is an identifier. You can see line 9. The computer does not know what this is, this hello identifier. Just like variables, we give our functions an identifier or a name. And as I mentioned, these programs are evaluated from the top down. And by the time it reaches this in the main function, it doesn't know about this. So that is why you want to put it up here before you reach the calling function. And the caller again in this main function, this is the caller. In its body, it calls or invokes this function. So main is the calling function for this. And if this hello function should have returned something, then it would have returned that back to the caller, in this case main. So we'll talk about that again in the next video. Alright, another thing that you might make the mistake sometimes is to declare a function within another function. You know, as a beginner, you are used to doing everything in the main function pretty much. So that might be a common mistake. You'll see if I build and run this, that will get an error in the error list. And it basically says hello, so that function, local function definitions are illegal. That means you cannot define one function in another function. You can see if I bring up the documentation and it says code tries to define a function within a function. You can see here void some function in main, so that'll give you an error. So again, you want this to be global. So outside of the current function, you want to typically declare your functions in the global space. So outside of other named code blocks, such as here, we talked about global scope previously. So in the global scope and before the calling function is where you will declare your function. Build and run that, and you can see that works. Alright, so I'm going to leave it here, and in the next video we'll take a look at value returning functions.